The bioscanner's display bathed Dr. Elara Vance's face in cold amber light, the kind of light that made her look older than her 34 years. She leaned closer to the screen, fingers tapping through data streams, with the weary precision of someone who had already run the same diagnostics a dozen times that week. Outside the polycarbon dome of Outpost Vigil, the Elderwood stretched its ancient canopy toward a sky that had never been kind to it. The forest was dying. The numbers didn't lie. Elara was a lean woman, all sharp angles and restless energy, with dark hair pulled back in a practical twist that had come loose at her temples. Her cheekbones were prominent, a testament to too many missed meals and too many double shifts, and her eyes, a washed-out grey like storm clouds fading, held the focused exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting good news. She wore the standard issue-field tunic of the Terra Restoration Corps, sleeves rolled up despite the station's climate control, struggling to hold back the planet's creeping cold. Her wrists were bare, except for the thin silver band of her biomonitor, which tracked her vitals, and she sometimes suspected, her dwindling hope. The Elderwood was visible through the dome's transparency, a sprawling cathedral of gnarled trunks and bioluminescent moss that had somehow survived when every other terraformed forest on Calathis Prime had succumbed to the freeze. The rest of the planet was a white wasteland of failed atmosphere processing and collapsing ecosystems. But here, under the dome's fragile bubble, the last grove endured. For now, Elara pulled up the root system telemetry on her main display. The network was failing, nutrient flows stuttering like a failing heart. Necrosis had spread through 17% of the vascular tissue in the past month alone. She'd already filed the reports, each one more grim than the last, carbon-copied to Commander Sorrel's security logs and to the Academy on Earth. She knew what the responses would say. Continue monitoring. Minimize resource expenditure. Do not enter the grove without authorization standard protocol. She'd written half of it herself, back when she still believed the Elderwood could be saved by careful observation and controlled interventions. A soft chime interrupted her thoughts. The biosignature monitor, a secondary display she'd configured to track electrical impulses in the forest's neural-like root network, had flagged an anomaly. She turned, frowning. The pattern on the screen was rhythmic, pulsing in a sequence that felt almost deliberate. She'd seen random fluctuations before, the ambient noise of a dying ecosystem. This wasn't that. She tapped the display, isolating the signal. It originated from deep within the grove, from the area she'd designated as the Heartwood, the oldest and most deeply rooted section of the forest. The impulse repeated a pattern of 11 distinct spikes, followed by a pause, then 11 more, and again and again. Elara's throat tightened. She called up the comparative analysis, running it against known biological communication patterns. The result appeared in seconds, 94.7% match with sentient neural signaling. That can't be right, she murmured, the words swallowed by the hum of the station's life support systems. She ran the analysis 94.7%. She stood, her chair rolling back to bump against the console behind her. Protocol dictated she report the anomaly to Commander Sorrel and wait for authorization to investigate. But Sorrel was off shift, and the authorization would take hours the forest might not have. And this signal, this impossible, deliberate signal, it was reaching out. She could feel it in her gut, a primal certainty that bypassed reason. She grabbed her field jacket from the hook by the airlock, a lightweight thermal weave in the muted green of the core. She checked her belt, handheld bioscanner, field recorder, a small medkit in a sealed pouch. The scanner's battery was at 82%. She clipped it to her belt. The medkit contained a dermal regenerator, 2 analgesic patches, and a roll of self-adhesive bandage, standard field fare. She tucked the field recorder into her jacket pocket and pressed the airlock cycle. The outer door opened with a hiss of equalizing pressure. Elara stepped into the dome's interior, the air humid and thick with the scent of loam and decay. The Elderwood rose around her like the pillars of a ruined cathedral, their bark fissured and dark, streaked with the pale blue luminescence of dying moss. The ground was soft under her boots, a carpet of fallen needles and the occasional curling fern that still clung to life. The silence was heavy, broken only by the distant drip of condensation from the dome's apex and the faint, ever-present hum of the atmospheric processors. She walked the maintenance path, a gravel track that wound between the larger trunks. The bioscanner on her belt chirped, guiding her deeper into the grove, past the marker stones she'd placed during her first survey months ago. The trees grew closer here, their branches interlocking overhead in a lattice that filtered the dome's artificial light into shifting patterns. The luminescence was stronger too, pulsing faintly in time with the signal on her scanner. At the center of the grove, she stopped. The tree before her was older than the others, its trunk massive and gnarled, its bark textured like the skin of some ancient slumbering creature. Its roots broke the surface of the earth in great sweeping arcs, cradling a hollow at its base that was large enough to shelter a person. The bioluminescence here was not the sickly blue of the outer grove, but a deep, vibrant gold, pulsing in rhythm with the scanner's steady beat. And then the air in front of the tree began to shift. It started as a shimmer, a heat-haze distortion that resolved into something more. There was a form taking shape, not solid, not human, but present. It was tall and slender, its body woven from strands of golden light and shadow, its limbs elongated like the branches of a willow. Its face was a shifting constellation of motes, and when it turned toward Elara, she felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure against her chest. "You hear us?" The voice did not come through her ears. It resonated inside her skull, a harmonic chorus of tones that was at once alien and achingly familiar. Elara stumbled back a step, her hand going to her belt, but the scanner was silent now. The figure, the heartwood, she knew, though she couldn't say how, remained where it was, its light ribbon limbs swaying in a breeze she could not feel. "What are you?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "We are what remains, the last thought of a world that was meant to bloom. The terraforming failed, child of Earth. The cold will take us, as it took the others, unless we take root elsewhere, elsewhere." Elara shook her head, trying to process the words. "The rest of Calathis is dead, there is no elsewhere." The heartwood's form rippled, and she felt a wave of grief crash over her. Not her own, but shared, a sorrow so vast it nearly drove her to her knees. The golden light dimmed, then flared. "There is you shed your skin, and we shall weave a new world." Before Elara could respond, a shriek cut through the grove. It was the dome's breach alarm, a piercing wail that she'd only ever heard in drills. Her wristcom lit up with emergency alerts. Constructural integrity fascia inection 7. Atmospheric breach imminent. Evacuate to shelter. She turned, eyes searching the dome's curvature. A crack, fine as a hairline fracture, was spreading across the polycarbon panels above the eastern perimeter. The cold outside, the killing cold of Calathis's failed atmosphere, was already seeping through, condensing into a visible mist that roiled down toward the forest floor. The dome wasn't going to hold. Elara ran. The maintenance path was 40 meters, 50, too far. The cold mist was cascading now, a silent waterfall of white that killed every fern it touched. The fronds blackening and shriveling in seconds. Her lungs burned. Her boot caught on a root and she stumbled, catching herself on the rough bark of a tree. The hollow at the base of the great tree. It was shelter, small but sealed from the open air. She dove inside, pulling her knees to her chest as the mist rolled past the opening. The temperature dropped so fast her breath plumed white. She pressed herself deeper into the hollow, the scent of ancient wood and damp earth filling her nostrils. The breach alarm was muffled here, a distant shriek that seemed to belong to another world. She could feel the vibration of the dome's failing support struts through the ground, a deep groaning shudder that spoke of imminent collapse. And then she felt something else. A tendril of the great tree, no thicker than her finger, was coiling slowly around her left wrist. She hadn't noticed it in the dark, hadn't felt it, until the tip pressed against the soft skin just below her palm. She tried to pull away, but the tendril tightened, and then there was a sharp, searing pain, a puncture precise and clean as it slipped beneath her skin. Elara screamed. The world fell away. She was no longer in the hollow. She was the forest, her roots stretching deep into frozen soil, her branches reaching toward a dome that was splintering above her. She felt the death of every fern, the slow starvation of every fiber, the crushing loneliness of being the last living thing on a world that had been promised to bloom. And beneath that, she felt the heartwood, their consciousness, ancient and desperate, wrapping around her own like vines seeking sunlight. The merge was not gentle. It was a violation and a revelation, a flood of alien sensation that rewrote her at a cellular level. Her DNA unwound and reknit, accepting foreign sequences that were older than humanity, older than the planet itself. There were images, too fast to process, a forest spreading across a barren world, a network of minds linked in symbiotic harmony, a promise of survival that required only her surrender. She didn't know how long it lasted. When the pain receded, when her senses returned to the confines of her own body, she was lying curled in the hollow, her forehead pressed to the cold earth. The breach alarm had stopped. The mist was gone, the dome's emergency sealant having finally activated, though the eastern panels were a spider-webbed mess of cracks and frozen condensation. Elara pushed herself up, her muscles trembling. She looked at her left wrist. A ring of thorns had sprouted from the skin where the tendril had pierced her. They were delicate, dark as obsidian, curling around her wrist in a spiral that resembled a bracer woven from living bramble. The surrounding flesh was not angry or inflamed, but smooth, as if the growth had simply emerged from within her and settled into place. When she flexed her fingers, the thorns shifted, flexing with her movement. She should have felt horror. Instead, what rose in her chest was a quiet, unsettling acceptance. She tugged her sleeve down over the growth, the fabric catching slightly on the thorns, and crawled out of the hollow. The grove had changed. The luminescence of the moss had shifted from dying blue to a muted gold, and she could feel it. The pulse of the forest's slow heartbeat, the whisper of its thoughts at the edge of her mind. The heartwood was no longer visible, but they were present, a constant pressure in her awareness, like a second shadow. She walked back to the station on unsteady legs. The airlock cycled, the inner door slid shut, and she stood alone in the amber-lit monitoring room, her field jacket still cold to the touch. She did not log the incident. She did not call Commander Sorrel. She sat down at her console, her covered wrist resting on the edge of the keyboard, and stared at the data streams that now pulsed with a rhythm she understood without needing to analyze. The forest didn't need a gardener anymore, she thought. The words rising unbidden from some place that was no longer entirely her own. It needed a heart. And against all reason, against every protocol she had ever written, it had found one. Elara closed her eyes. The whispers of the Elderwood rustled through her mind, soft as wind through leaves, and she knew with cold certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The monitoring room felt smaller than it had 3 days ago. Or perhaps Elara was the thing that had changed, her edges blurring into something that no longer fit neatly inside polycarbon walls and regulation-spaced consoles. She stood before the root system telemetry display, arms crossed tight against her chest, watching amber data streams cascade down the screen. The necrosis reading still held at 17%, no worse, but no better. The forest was stable, alive, in a way it hadn't been before the merger, but stable wasn't thriving, and thriving was what the heartwood had promised. Beneath her field jacket, the skin of her left forearm itched. She'd felt it first the morning after the breach. A roughness on her wrist, spreading upward from the ring of thorns in delicate concentric spirals. By the second day, the texture had thickened into something unmistakable. Bark pale at first, the color of birch saplings, then darkening to a deep brown that matched the great tree in the grove. It climbed her arm in patches, each one warm to the touch, each one pulsing with a heartbeat that wasn't quite her own. And her eyes. She'd caught her reflection in the black glass of a dormant monitor yesterday evening, and nearly gasped. The washed-out grey she'd known for 34 years had shifted. Now, when the light hit at certain angles, a faint green luminescence flickered in her irises, barely perceptible, but there like moss glowing after rainfall. The forest's voice had grown louder too. Not words, exactly, not the clear telepathic speech the heartwood had used in the grove. More like the rustle of leaves translated into emotion. Impatience, hunger, an ancient sadness that pooled behind her sternum and made her want to weep for reasons she couldn't name. It was strongest near the monitoring room's eastern wall, the one closest to the damaged Section 7. "We are idle," the whisper seemed to say. "We must spread, we must root soon," Elara murmured, and the word came out half breathless, as if she'd been running. "I need more time," the biosignature monitor chirped. A secondary display mounted on the wall, the one she'd configured to track the forest's electrical impulses, showed the familiar 11-spike rhythm repeating at steady intervals. Faster than before the merger, though. The spikes came every 43 seconds now, down from 58. The forest was waking up, and it was waking up, restless. Elara's hand drifted to her left sleeve, tugging the thermal weave down over her wrist. The dark thorns of the ring pressed against the fabric, sharp enough to catch if she moved wrong. She'd taken to wearing the jacket, even inside the climate-controlled station, the collar pulled high, the cuffs sealed tight, hiding, always hiding now. What would Commander Sorrel do if he saw? He was off shift, had been since the breach. His rotation had him sleeping during the station's artificial night cycle, and she'd timed her monitoring sessions to avoid him. But how long could avoidance hold? The door hissed open behind her. Elara spun, heart lurching, her right hand, moving instinctively to cover her left forearm. The motion was too quick, too guilty, and she knew it even before her eyes found the figure standing in the doorway. Aaron Thorne had always been able to read her like a field report. He stood there in his standard issue corps tunic, a lighter grey than hers, marking his senior research status, with a datapad clutched in one hand and the other braced against the doorframe. His hair was a shade lighter than she remembered from the academy, sun-streaked at the temples now, and the angles of his face had sharpened with the years. But his eyes were the same, pale blue, analytical, the kind of eyes that noticed everything and forgave almost nothing. "What?" he said slowly. "Was that?" "Nothing." The word came too fast. "You startled me, that's all. Bullshit." He stepped inside, letting the door seal behind him. "I've been standing in the corridor for 30 seconds. You've been staring at that screen like it was going to bite you." Elara forced her shoulders to relax, or to approximate relaxation anyway. The bark patches on her forearm prickled, as if the heartwood could sense her tension and was responding in kind. "It's late. I thought you were off shift." "I was." Aaron set his datapad on the nearest console, his gaze never leaving her face. "Then I got an alert from the biomonitor archives. Someone's been accessing the genetic sequencing logs without proper authorization. Every night this week, between 0200 and 0400, her stomach dropped. She'd been careful, she'd covered her tracks, but Aaron had always been the better programmer, the one who could spot patterns in noise, and she should have known, that the automated flags would find him even if they didn't find Sorrel. "That's confidential data," she said, her voice steadier now. "You shouldn't be prying into my research." "Your research?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Elara, the genetic sequencing logs are restricted because they contain baseline human profiles for every corps member on this outpost. You're not supposed to run those unless someone's been exposed to a biological hazard, and you definitely shouldn't be running them on yourself." He'd figured it out. Of course he had. The realization settled over her like cold mist from the breach, the same cold that had killed the ferns, that had driven her into the hollow of the great tree and changed everything. Slowly, deliberately, Aaron took a step closer. The monitoring room was small. There wasn't much distance to close. "Elara, what's wrong with you?" "Nothing is wrong with me." The words came out sharper than she intended, a blade drawn in self-defense. "You're overstepping, Thorne. Whatever you think you saw in those logs, I saw aberrant nucleotide sequences in a human genome that was clean 48 hours prior." Calm, clinical. The voice he'd always used when presenting findings at the academy, when they'd stood shoulder to shoulder in front of review panels and defended each other's work. "I saw DNA that doesn't match any terrestrial species. I saw changes that should take millennia compressed into days." He reached for her, and she flinched back, too late. His fingers caught the edge of her sleeve, and the fabric rode up, just an inch, just enough to reveal the dark, ridged bark that spiraled up her wrist and disappeared under the cuff. Aaron went very still. "What?" he breathed. "Is that?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy as frost. Elara could feel the heartwood stirring at the edge of her consciousness, curious, unafraid. "Show him," it seemed to whisper. "Show him what we are becoming." She pulled her arm free, gently, because she could have broken his grip if she'd wanted to, and that knowledge was terrifying. She'd felt the strength growing in her limbs over the past 3 days. The way door handles felt flimsier. The way she could hear the life humming in the walls, in the atmospheric processes, in the root systems buried deep beneath the station's foundations. "It's the price," she said quietly. "For the merger." "The what?" she told him. "Not everything. Not the way the Heartwood's consciousness still coiled in the back of her mind like a second pulse. But the breach, the hollow, the tendril piercing her wrist. Those truths came out in a rush, as if speaking them aloud made them somehow more real, more justified." Aaron listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from horror to disbelief to something she couldn't quite read. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "You've been walking around for 3 days, he said finally, "with an alien organism integrated into your body, and you didn't think to tell anyone. Who would I tell?" Elara gestured at the monitoring screens, at the steady pulse of the forest's heartbeat scrolling across the display. "Sorrel? He'd have me sedated and shipped to a core containment facility before the hour was out. And you." She stopped. The words caught in her throat, tangled with memories she'd spent 2 years trying not to revisit. "I didn't think you'd want to know," she finished lamely. Aaron's jaw tightened. He knew what she wasn't saying. They both did. Academy. 6 years ago. A lecture hall filled with the brightest minds the Terra Restoration Corps could recruit, and Elara Vance at the center of it, 28 years old, already a rising star, already burning herself out on dying worlds. She'd spent 3 nights without sleep preparing her presentation on Calathis Prime, on the Elderwood's unique neural architecture, on the possibility of sentient interaction. When she'd finished, the hall had erupted in debate. Most of the faculty had dismissed her findings as speculative. Too little data, too much emotional investment. But Aaron Thorne had been in the 3rd row, and he hadn't dismissed anything. Their partnership had started there, in the margins of her research notes, in late-night arguments over protein sequences and root system mapping. Within a year, it had become more: coffee shared in the lab, then dinners, then waking up in his quarters with the artificial dawnlights just beginning to glow. He'd been the only person who could match her intensity, who could argue with her for hours, and then kiss her. Like the argument itself had been a form of love. It ended the way everything ended with Elara, slowly then all at once. Calathis Prime's terraforming had failed, the Corps was pulling funding, and she'd refused to abandon the Elderwood, even when her assignment rotation expired, even when Aaron had gotten them both a place on a new terraforming project on Lysalis South. "It's still alive," she'd said, standing in their shared quarters with a half-packed duffel at her feet. "I can feel it, Aaron. I can't just walk away." Just because you can hear something dying doesn't mean you have to die with it. He'd meant it as a kindness. She'd taken it as a betrayal. They hadn't spoken for 11 months after that, and then the Corps had assigned him to Outpost Vigil as the senior research consultant, and she'd been forced to see his face in the corridors every day, carrying the weight of everything they'd never said. "Elara." His voice pulled her back to the present. "This isn't the same thing as staying in a doomed outpost. This is your body, your DNA. You can't just..." He stopped, exhaled sharply. "You need treatment. There's a dermal regenerator in your medkit, for God's sake. Have you even tried?" "The dermal regenerator won't fix this." She rolled up her sleeve, letting him see the full extent of the bark now. The smooth ridges running from wrist to elbow, the way the thorns at her pulse point had multiplied into a dark spiral, the faint golden veins threading through the brown like sap. "This isn't a wound, Aaron. It's a graft." He stared at her arm, at the thorns, at the biomonitor wristband still strapped over the bark, its readings flickering between human and something else entirely. "If you won't get help," he said slowly, "I'll have to report this. You know that. I know your regulations." She pulled her sleeve back down, covering the evidence. "But before you do, look at this." She turned to the root system telemetry display and pulled up the deep layer diagnostics. Nutrient flows, vascular integrity, cellular regeneration rates. A week ago, every metric had trended downward. Necrosis spreading, root structures collapsing, the forest's slow, inevitable slide toward extinction. Now the screen showed something else. The necrosis still held at 17%, but the borders of the damaged tissue had stopped advancing. In some places, small ones, barely clusters of cells, there were signs of regrowth, new root tendrils reaching deeper into the soil, vascular pathways clearing. The forest's circulatory system, so recently failing, had begun to stabilize. "It's healing," Elara said. "Not enough, not fast enough, but it's healing." "And do you know what changed?" Aaron was staring at the screen, his expression unreadable. The merger. She turned to face him fully. The Heartwood needed a vessel, someone whose biology could bridge the gap between their consciousness and the rest of the forest. "If I go to Sorrel, if I let the Corps take me apart in some lab, the connection breaks, the forest dies." "Elara, I felt it, Aaron." The words came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep inside her chest. "When the tendril pierced my wrist, I felt everything they've been holding, millions of years of memory. A world that was supposed to bloom, and instead it froze. And they've been here alone ever since. They didn't want to hurt me. They wanted to survive." Silence filled the monitoring room. The biosignature monitor chirped again. 11 spikes, the forest's heartbeat, pushing out through the roots, through the soil, through Elara's own pulse. Aaron looked at her arm, at the screen, at her eyes, still faintly luminescing in the dim light. "I can't believe I'm even considering this," he muttered. "Considering what?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the secondary console and pulled up the genetic sequencing logs. The same ones she'd been accessing in secret, the same ones that had flagged his attention. His fingers moved across the interface with practiced efficiency, clearing the alert markers, burying the audit trail. "Your security protocols are sloppy," he said. Anyone with half a brain could follow the breadcrumbs you left. If Sorrel checks the logs, he won't. He's focused on the dome damage. He'll check eventually. And when he does, this trail needs to be cold. Aaron finished his work and stepped back from the console. His hands were shaking slightly, she noticed. The only sign that any of this was affecting him at all. The genetic archives will show your baseline as unchanged. The sequencer logs will show routine maintenance scans. No anomalies. Elara stared at him. You're helping me. I'm not. His voice was hard, but his eyes, those pale, analytical eyes, had softened. I'm falsifying core records to cover up a biological contamination event because the alternative is watching the last sentient forest on this planet die. That's not the same thing. Aaron, don't. He held up a hand. We're not doing this. We're not going to pretend that the last 2 years didn't happen, and we're not going to talk about Lysalis South, and we're definitely not going to stand here and act like I'm some kind of hero for. He broke off, jaw working. I'm helping the forest, Elara. Not you. It was a lie. They both knew it. But she nodded anyway, because she didn't have the strength to argue, and because the heartwood was murmuring at the back of her skull. Trust him, trust him, trust him. And beneath the ancient alien consciousness, she could feel something else, something human, something that still recognized the shape of his name in her mouth. I need access to your research, he said, more quietly now. Everything you've documented since the merger. I need to know how fast the integration is progressing, what the long-term effects might be, and whether there's any risk of it spreading to other organisms. I've been keeping notes. She retrieved her field recorder from her jacket pocket and handed it to him. Audio logs, observations, vital sign readings from the biomonitor. She hesitated. Some of it you won't like. He took the recorder without meeting her eyes. When have I ever liked anything about this project? She almost smiled. Almost. And then the station-wide comm system crackled to life. Attention, outpost vigil personnel. This is Commander Sorrel. Elara's blood went cold. The bark on her arm prickled, the thorns contracting against her skin like fingertips pressing down. By order of the Terra Restoration Corps Executive Board, Sorrel's voice continued, flat and clipped. All research activities at Outpost Vigil are suspended effective immediately. Economic review has determined that the Elderwood's remaining biomass is no longer viable for terraforming purposes. A corporate harvesting team will arrive in 72 hours to begin extraction operations. The words hit like a physical blow. Extraction. The Corps' sterile term for slicing the ancient trees into usable timber, processing the root systems into organic compounds, selling whatever remained of the Elderwood to the highest bidder. All personnel are to cease non-essential tasks and prepare for decommissioning protocols. That is all. The comm went silent. Elara's hands were shaking. She could feel the heartwood surging beneath her skin, a wave of grief and fury so intense that it blurred her vision, turned the amber lights of the monitoring room into streaks of gold. 72 hours. They would reduce the forest to lumber in 72 hours. Elara. Aaron's voice, sharp with alarm. Your eyes. She didn't need a mirror to know what he was seeing. The green luminescence was no longer faint. It blazed in her irises like twin suns, casting pale shadows across his face. The forest, she whispered. The forest won't survive this. You won't survive this. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. If they harvest the Elderwood, what happens to the heartwood? What happens to you? She didn't have an answer. But somewhere deep in her consciousness, beneath the terror and the rage and the ancient, desperate grief, she could feel the heartwood's response. Not words, not a plan, just a single crystalline emotion that pulsed through her veins like sap, like blood, like the 11-beat rhythm of a world that refused to die spread. We have 72 hours, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. You said you'd help me. Aaron stared at her for a long moment, at the bark spiraling up her arm, at the thorns flexing at her wrist, at the light burning in her eyes. Then he nodded, once the way he'd nodded at the academy, when she'd shown him her first data on the Elderwood's neural network, the way he'd always nodded before following her into the impossible. I said I'd help the forest, he corrected, but his voice had lost its edge. So tell me, what do we do? The monitoring room felt smaller than it had 3 days ago. Elara Vance stood with her back to the biosignature monitor, its amber waveforms painting the 11-spike rhythm across the wall every 43 seconds. Her field jacket was sealed to her wrists, collar turned up, but the faint green luminescence in her eyes could not be hidden. Aaron Thorne had stopped pretending not to notice. He leaned against the console. The field recorder she'd given him still in his hand, as if the weight of her recorded confessions might anchor them both. "There's a room," he said quietly. "Off the Eastern Service Corridor, old growth chamber from the first botanical survey. It's not on any schematic they'd check." Elara turned. The bark on her left forearm pressed against the sleeve's thermal weave, a ridge of dark brown shot through with gold. "A greenhouse, hidden, isolated. We'll need to repurpose it." Aaron's pale blue eyes moved to her collar, where the edge of a thorn pressed against the fabric. "You can't keep testing the merge here. Sorrel's audit sweeps will pick up the bioscanner pings within 48 hours. The heartwood stirred behind her ribs, a second pulse that was not a heartbeat. She felt its impatience, an ancient hunger wrapped in grief. Go now." She nodded and stepped past him, toward the door. The Eastern Service corridor smelled of frozen metal and old sterilizing agents. At its end, a pressure door with a manual crank led into a narrow compartment that had once housed failed terraforming samples. Now it was a hollow cavity 30 meters long and 4 wide, its polycarbon ceiling panes milky with age. Shelves lined the walls, most empty, a few still holding desiccated root balls and inert nutrient packs. A single atmospheric processor wheezed in the corner, its indicator glowing amber. Erin sealed the door behind them. The lock was mechanical, not electronic, no logging, no monitoring. "This was your contingency," Elara said, moving to the center of the room. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled as she unsealed her left cuff and pushed the sleeve back. The ring of thorns had spread. Now a spiral of dark barbs climbed from wrist to elbow, each one tipped with a droplet of golden sap that never fell. Bark plates layered over her skin like a gauntlet, and where they parted, veins pulsed with the same luminescence as her eyes. Aaron set the field recorder on a shelf and pulled out his datapad. "I can reroute the biosignature monitor's secondary feed here. We'll have the same data as the main console, but I need to understand what we're trying to achieve. The splice is already stable, biologically. It's your consciousness that's fragmenting." "The forest doesn't need a gardener anymore," Elara said, repeating the words the heartwood had whispered into her dreams. "It needs a heart. Just because you can merge with a tree doesn't mean you should." Aaron's voice cracked on the last word, and he looked away, jaw tight. She reached out with her right hand, still human, still warm, and touched his wrist. "I'm not asking you to approve. I'm asking you to help me hear them clearly. The heartwood speaks in images, in scent and pressure. I need words, Aaron. If we can establish full communication, they can tell us how to save the Elderwood before the harvesters arrive." He exhaled slowly. "There's a neural conduction protocol in the old Academy files. It was designed for mapping sentient flora, never field-tested. We'd need a direct interface, something that bridges your nervous system with the root network. The bioscanner has a low-frequency transmission mode." Elara unclipped her handheld bioscanner from her belt. The amber display lit up, still showing 82% battery. "I can adapt it. But I need something to dampen my human autonomic responses. The pain signals keep interfering." Erin's gaze dropped to her medkit. "You have analgesic patches, too." She knelt, opened the sealed pouch, and removed one of the thin adhesive squares. The dermal regenerator glinted uselessly inside. She pressed the patch to the inside of her right wrist, where the skin was still soft. A cool numbness spread through her arm, and for a moment, the heartwood's presence surged, flooding her senses with the scent of wet earth and the sound of 1,000 roots growing in the dark. She gasped, "Elara, I'm here." But her voice had taken on a harmonic resonance, a second layer beneath the words. She sat cross-legged on the floor, the bioscanner in her lap, its transmission node against the bark of her left arm. Aaron tapped his datapad, routing the feed, and the scanner began to emit a low hum. The heartwood spoke shed the noise of your flesh. "Let us into the silence, not images now, but language fragmented, ancient yet intelligible." Elara's eyes flared green, and the bark on her arm tightened, sending a bolt of pain through the analgesic haze. She bit down on a cry. Aaron knelt in front of her. "Tell me what you hear. They're afraid. The harvest order. They felt it, Aaron. Through the root network, every tree in the grove is screaming." The harmonic in her voice deepened. "And they're dying. The collective consciousness won't survive much longer. There are gaps, memories dissolving. They need a vessel that can hold everything. You. I'm the only one." The field recorder on the shelf was still running. Neither of them noticed. The alert came 2 hours later, as the artificial night cycle deepened. Aaron's datapad lit up with a station-wide message. Asterisk supply audit initiated. All personnel to log requisitioned materials by 600. "He's checking the inventory," Aaron muttered. glancing at the nutrient packs and the portable atmospheric stabilizer they'd pulled from storage. Sorrel's doing a manual cross-reference. Elara lay on the floor now, her eyes half closed, the bioscanner still pressed to her arm. The analgesic patch had worn thin, and she was shaking. "Go. I'll stay here," he hesitated. "Go, Aaron." He left the room at a walk, then broke into a jog through the corridor, his field jacket billowing. By the time he reached the operations center, Commander Kalen Sorrel was already waiting. Sorrel was a man carved from old military discipline, mid-50s, with a scar that ran from jaw to temple across weathered skin and dark eyes that missed nothing. His hair was cropped silver, his posture rigid. He stood beside a supply terminal, scrolling through items that had been checked out in the past 72 hours. Thorn. The voice was gravel, calm, but edged. "I've got 3 missing nutrient packs, a portable atmospheric unit, and a set of sterile growth trays. Care to explain?" Aaron stopped a respectful distance away, his pale blue eyes steady. "I pulled them for an off-book experiment, 1 silver eyebrow rose. Off-book, I've been running a root regeneration trial on a section of the eastern perimeter. The necrosis is stable at 17%, but I thought if I could isolate a healthy cluster and force new growth, we'd have a bargaining chip when the harvesting team arrives." "Something to show the forest isn't dead." Sorrel studied him. "Why keep it off the logs?" "Because if it failed, I didn't want it used as evidence that the Elderwood is beyond saving, and if it succeeded, I wanted to control the narrative." A long pause. The distant hum of the atmospheric processors filled the silence. Sorrel's scar seemed to tighten as he spoke. "I've seen worlds burn, Thorn. This one will freeze if we don't act, but not like this. If you're hiding something that compromises the extraction, I'll find it." He stepped closer. "You've been spending a lot of time with Dr. Vance. She hasn't filed a status report in days. She's been ill. The breach, she was in Section 7 when it happened. Cold exposure. The lie came easily now, built on a foundation of truth. I've been covering her shifts." Sorrel held his gaze for 3 seconds, then nodded slowly. "I'll flag the supplies as field research for now. But at 0600, I want a full status update on your regeneration trial, and I want to see Dr. Vance myself." He turned and walked away, boots clicking on the metal floor. Aaron waited until the sound faded, then exhaled through clenched teeth and headed back to the greenhouse. When he opened the door, the room was empty. The bioscanner lay on the floor, still humming. The analgesic patch had left a red mark on Elara's wrist, and her field jacket was draped over a shelf. But she was gone. Panic flared. He grabbed his datapad, pulled up the biomonitor wristband signal. It was still active, moving toward the dome interior. Toward the grove. The night inside the grove was a cathedral of cold mist and green luminescence. The moss glowed gold at Elara's feet as she walked between the ancient trees, bare-armed, the bark now spreading past her elbow to her shoulder. Her field jacket she'd left behind. It could not hide what she was becoming. The Heartwood's voice was no longer inside her head. It came from every tree at once, a chorus of rustling leaves and creaking timber. "You have come. I heard you," Elara whispered. The silence between the noise. "You said you would vanish by dawn. The necrosis is spreading faster now, the harvesting order. It wounds us before the blades arrive. Our old roots remember the ice, and they are letting go. Without a complete merge, the collective will fragment. We will become merely wood." Elara stopped beneath the Elderwood, the central tree, whose trunk was as wide as a dropship, and whose canopy brushed the cracked polycarbon dome. The bark here wept golden sap in long, slow rivulets. "What must I do?" "Shed your skin, and we shall weave a new world." She understood then. Not a partial merger, not a shared existence, a transformation. The Heartwood would pour its entire consciousness into her body, remaking her into a vessel that could walk out of the dome, find new soil, and root. She would bear the forest's seeds and memories. But the woman she had been would dissolve into the bark. The cold mist swirled. Somewhere above, a spiderweb of cracks glinted in Section 7, the emergency sealant still holding against the frozen wasteland beyond. Elara reached out and pressed her palm to the Elderwood's trunk. The world turned golden. Aaron found her an hour later, just before the artificial dawn cycle began. He had run through the grove, calling her name. The field recorder clutched in one hand. When he reached the Elderwood, he stopped. She stood upright, but she was no longer simply Elara. The bark plates had consumed her left arm entirely and now crept across her collarbone and neck. Her dark hair, once pulled back in a tight knot, had fallen away. In its place, slender willow-like leaves grew from her scalp, pale green and veined with gold. Her eyes were not merely glowing. They were solid orbs of green light, no pupil, no white. When she breathed, her chest moved stiffly, as if her ribs had become something else beneath the skin. She turned to face him, and her movements were slow, deliberate, the creak of wood beneath flesh. "It's done," she said. Her voice was two-toned now, her own, and the resonant hum of the forest. "They'll survive, Aaron. Not here, not as they were, but in me." He crossed the distance between them and caught her right hand, the one that was still flesh. "It was cold. You didn't ask. I didn't have time." The leaves rustled softly, though there was no wind. Dawn was coming, and I wasn't sure you'd let me go. I wouldn't have. His voice broke. He pulled her closer, not caring about the thorns, not caring about the bark. "Just because you can turn into a forest doesn't mean you should have to do it alone." She tilted her head. The luminous eyes fixed on him, and something of the old Elara flickered there, the stubborn set of her jaw, the scientist who had refused to leave a dying world. "You kept my secret. You falsified the logs. You've done more than anyone could ask. Then, let me do one more thing." He held up the field recorder. "This, all your logs. The truth about the heartwood. When the harvesting team arrives, I'll broadcast it. I'll make sure the Corps knows what they're destroying." Elara's wooden fingers closed around his. "They'll court-martial you, probably." He managed a thin smile, the sun-streaked hair at his temples catching the fading moonlight. "But you taught me something, back at the academy. The data doesn't lie. I'll let the data speak for you." From outside the dome, a low mechanical whine began to build, a sound neither of them had heard before. It was distant but growing, the unmistakable vibration of turbine engines spooling up. The harvest drones, Elara's leaves shivered. "They're warming the equipment early. Sorrel must have ordered the perimeter prepped." Erin looked toward the dome wall. Through the cracks in Section 7, he could see the first glint of running lights against the frozen horizon. "Then we don't have 72 hours. We have whatever time it takes you to become what you need to be." She nodded, and for a moment she seemed to forget how human necks moved. The motion was too smooth, too mechanical. "I'll seed the world, Aaron, but I need you to protect the place where I root." He pulled her into an embrace, feeling the thorns press against his chest but refusing to flinch. "I'll guard it with my life." The harvest drones hummed louder, a chorus of engines on the edge of the wasteland. Inside the dome, the moss pulsed once, twice, in rhythm with the 11-spike heartbeat, now 39 seconds apart. The forest was accelerating, and in its center, a woman who had once been a scientist held the man who had once been her lover, both of them knowing they would not hold each other this way again. The dawn cycle began, and the dome's artificial sun flickered on, casting long shadows through the trees. One of those shadows no longer looked entirely human. The turbines spooled up in a rising whine that vibrated through the polycarbon dome like a bow dragged across glass. Aaron felt it in his molars first, then in the bones of his wrists as he clutched the field recorder tighter. The artificial dawn cycle had barely begun to warm the eastern panels, casting long amber streaks across the grove floor, but the harvest drones didn't wait for full light. Their shadows flickered against the damaged Section 7 wall, angular, mechanical, wrong among the willow-like branches. Elara stood motionless beside the Elderwood's trunk, her bare feet sunk into the blue moss that had turned gold 3 days ago. The bark plates covering her left arm had spread overnight, crawling up her shoulder and across her collarbone in overlapping scales of dark brown, veined with threads of golden sap that pulsed in time with the forest's 11-spike rhythm. The willow-like leaves that had replaced her hair rustled, though there was no wind inside the dome. Her eyes, solid green light now, no iris, no white, were fixed on something Aaron couldn't see. Elara. He stepped toward her, the moss cushioning his boots. The field recorder was cold in his sweating palm. "The drones are early. Sorrel must have. The Corps is calling." Her voice had changed overnight. It still held her cadence, her precise academic diction, but underneath it ran a harmonic resonance, as if a second voice spoke in unison just below the threshold of hearing. "I can feel it beneath us, Aaron. The taproot. It goes down for kilometers, through the frozen crust, into the thermal veins. That's where the heartwood kept their memory. That's where I need to be." She turned, and the movement was no longer stiff. Her body had learned its new architecture. The bark on her neck creaked softly as she looked at him, and her leaf hair lifted in a gesture that was almost human, a tilt of curiosity, or perhaps farewell. "Just because you can merge with a tree doesn't mean you should." Aaron's voice cracked on the last word. He'd said it before in the greenhouse, when she'd first shown him the ring of thorns. It felt like years ago. It had been 3 days. Aaron Thorn. She said his full name the way she used to at the academy, when they'd stayed up arguing over datasets and terraforming ethics, and whether sentience could be quantified in a bioscanner's amber readout. The forest doesn't need a gardener anymore. It needs a heart. She knelt. Her hands, the right still flesh, the left bark and golden veins, pressed flat against the moss. The ground shivered, the moss brightened, its luminescence climbing from gold to white, and the roots beneath the soil began to move. Aaron felt them through his boot soles, a slow, muscular shifting, like tectonic plates realigning. Don't. He lunged forward and grabbed her shoulder. The bark was warm, warmer than human skin, and he felt the pulse beneath it. 39 seconds. The same rhythm the biosignature monitor had been screaming since the merge completed. Elara, don't do this. We can still. I can broadcast the logs. The core will have to listen. They can't harvest a sentient species if... The core will classify it as an anomaly and burn the evidence. She didn't look at him. Her green-lit eyes were fixed on the ground. On the roots she was calling upward. You know that. You've read the same executive orders I have. Then we hide you, the greenhouse. We can. There is no hiding now. Her voice softened, the harmonic undertone fading until only Elara remained. Just her, the woman he'd loved, the scientist who'd refused to abandon a dying forest, even when he'd begged her to transfer to Lesalis South. I'm sorry. For leaving you then. For leaving you now. But this was always the endpoint, Aaron. From the moment the first thorn broke my skin, I knew where I was going. I just didn't know how to tell you. His grip on her shoulder tightened. The bark was spreading as he watched, tiny fissures opening along her jaw, new leaves unfurling behind her ears. The biomonitor wristband on her left arm flickered wildly now, its silver band barely visible under the encroaching wood. I loved you, he said. Present tense, past tense, both. I know. She lifted her right hand, the last human part of her, and pressed it over his. Her fingers were cold. That's why I gave you the recorder. That's why you're here. Someone has to remember what we were. Someone has to tell them. The roots broke the surface. They came up in coils and spirals, dark brown threaded with gold, thicker than her thighs. They wrapped around her knees first, then her waist, gentle as a lover's arms. Moss tore, soil scattered. The elderwood above them groaned, and its branches, burdened with the same willow-like leaves that now grew from Elara's head, bent down to touch her shoulders. Aaron tried to pull her back. He locked his arms under hers and heaved, his boots sliding in the churned moss. But she was anchored now, rooted, immovable. Her weight had become the grove's weight. The roots tightened, and she sank 6 inches into the soil. Let her go. The voice came from the tree line. Commander Kalen Sorrel stepped into the clearing, and he was not alone. 4 security personnel flanked him in tactical formation, each carrying containment gear, sealant sprayers, restraint webbing, a portable stasis field generator that hummed with lethal voltage. Sorrel himself wore full operational armor, his cropped silver hair damp with condensation from the service corridor. The scar running from his jaw to his temple stood out white against his weathered skin, and his dark eyes. The eyes that missed nothing, fixed on Elara with an expression Aaron had never seen before. It wasn't horror. It wasn't even shock. It was recognition. Commander. Aaron didn't release his grip. You don't understand what's happening. I understand perfectly. Sorrel took 3 steps forward, and his squad fanned out behind him. I've seen worlds burn, Thorn. This one will freeze if we don't act, but not like this. He stopped 10 meters from the Elderwood, his armored boots crunching on scattered moss. The harvest drones buzzed overhead, close now, their shadows darkening the artificial dawn. Dr. Vance, can you hear me? Elara turned her head. The movement was slow, deliberate, as if her vertebrae had already fused into something less flexible than bone. The leaves of her hair brushed her shoulders with a sound like rain. Her face was still recognizable, still Elara, but bark plates had crept up her right cheek now, and the green light in her eyes had deepened to the color of old forests. I hear you, Commander. The harmonic undertone was stronger now. I've always heard you. The supply audits, the genetic sequencing flags. You've been looking for this. For us. I've been looking for an explanation. Sorrel's hand rested on his sidearm, but he didn't draw. My biomonitor archives flagged unauthorized access 3 weeks ago. Then the audit trails were scrubbed. Then my senior research consultant started lying about missing supplies, and now I find my chief botanist. He gestured at Elara, at the roots cocooning her body, at the Elderwood's branches bending to embrace her. Becoming a tree, not becoming. Elara's lips moved, but the voice seemed to come from everywhere now. From the roots, from the moss, from the dome's very structure. Returning the heartwood seeded this planet 50,000 years before humans discovered fire. They were the original terraformers. The core didn't fail here, Commander, they interrupted. One of the security personnel, a young woman with a stasis field projector, lowered her weapon slightly. Sir, is she still human? I am what I was always meant to be. Elara answered before Sorrel could. Shed your skin, and we shall weave a new world. The roots convulsed. They surged upward with a force that threw Aaron backward. He landed hard on the moss, the field recorder skittering from his grip, and when he looked up, Elara was no longer kneeling. She was standing, or something like standing. Her feet had elongated into taproots that drilled into the soil with mechanical precision, and her arms were stretching, fingers branching, the bark racing across her torso in wave after wave. Her medkit pouch burst at the seam, spilling its contents, one remaining analgesic patch, the useless dermal regenerator, a roll of self-adhesive bandage into the churning soil. The biomonitor wristband snapped with a sound like a gunshot, and its silver fragments scattered across the moss, her face distended. The human architecture of her skull flowed into new configurations, brow ridge extending, jaw broadening, cheekbones becoming something arboreal, but her eyes, those solid green orbs, remained fixed on Sorrel, and they were still aware, still pleading, still Elara, Commander. The word came from a mouth that was no longer a mouth, from a throat that was becoming heartwood. The crust is failing, the thermal veins are cooling, the forest can't survive in this dome anymore. It needs to go deeper, where the planet is still warm. Let me take it there. Let me root. Sorrel's squad was breaking. The stasis field projector hung limp in the young woman's hands. Another officer, a man with a sealant sprayer, backed away, his boots tangling in the moss. The harvest drones were directly overhead now, their turbines drowning out the atmospheric processes, and through the dome's eastern panels Aaron could see the first cutting arm extend. Sir. The young woman's voice shook. Orders? Sorrel didn't answer. He was watching Elara's face, what remained of it, as it surfaced and submerged in the tide of bark. Her leaf hair was spreading now, individual strands fusing into branches, each leaf a solar collector turning toward the artificial dawn. Her torso was indistinguishable from the Elderwood's trunk. Her legs had become a pillar of fused roots, and still her eyes pleaded. I've seen worlds burn, Sorrel said again, barely audible over the drones. His hand was still on his sidearm. His dark eyes, which missed nothing, were wet. I've never seen one choose to bloom. He raised his other hand, the hand that would have given the order to contain, to neutralize, to destroy, and made a cutting gesture across his throat. Stand down. The security squad froze. The young woman with the stasis projector blinked. Sir? Stand down. That's an order. Sorrel's voice snapped back to its military discipline, but there was something underneath it now, something that sounded almost like awe. Thorn, your datapad. Can you still access the biosignature monitor? Aaron scrambled to his feet, snatching the field recorder from the moss. Yes. The secondary feed is still routed to the greenhouse, but I can pull it here. Why? Because I need to know when it's done. Sorrel turned to face the grove. The roots had reached the dome wall now, pressing against the cracked polycarbon of Section 7, and where they touched, new growth erupted. Vines, shoots, a lattice of green that sealed the emergency patches with living tissue. The temperature, which had been dropping since the drones arrived, steadied, and I need you to broadcast those logs, every channel, every core frequency. Make sure the executive board can't bury this. Aaron stared at him. You're risking court-martial. I'm risking nothing. Sorrel's scar pulled tight as he set his jaw. The forest is dead, that's what my report will say. Necrosis reached 100% overnight. The Elderwood collapsed. Extraction is no longer economically viable. By the time the harvesting team confirms it, Dr. Vance will be... He looked at the tree that was rising now, rising from the spot where Elara had knelt, her features still visible in the grain of its trunk, the curve of her jaw, the arch of her brow, the impossible green light of her eyes. Rooted. The tree grew. It was not a gentle process. The soil buckled and split as the taproot drove downward, through the outpost's foundation, through the permafrost, into the thermal veins that the heartwood had mapped 1,000 centuries before humans named the stars. Branches spread outward, shedding willow-like leaves that drifted through the grove like green snow. The trunk thickened, bark plates interlacing in patterns that repeated the 11-spike rhythm, and at its base, the golden moss erupted in a wave that swept outward, washing over Aaron's boots, over Sorrel's armored greaves, over the feet of the security squad. The harvest drones halted, their cutting arms retracted. Whether Sorrel had given the order, or they'd simply encountered something their protocols couldn't classify. Aaron never learned. He knelt in the moss and opened his datapad. The biosignature monitor was still active. The secondary feed that he'd routed to the greenhouse still pulsed with data. The 11-spike rhythm was slowing now, spreading out, each beat lasting longer than the last. 39 seconds, 44, 51. Then it stopped. For a long, terrible moment, the datapad showed flatline. Then a new signal emerged. A single pulse, deep and slow like a planet breathing. It repeated once, twice, 3 times, and with each pulse, the tree's leaves shimmered gold. Aaron looked up. The tree towered above him, its crown pressing against the dome's apex, its roots spreading through the grove like a second forest. Elara's face was still there, carved into the bark, her eyes now closed, her expression peaceful. The Heartwood's consciousness, the last thought of a world that was meant to bloom, had found its vessel. Sorrel was already transmitting. His voice was steady, professional, the voice of a commander filing a routine report. Operations report, Outpost Vigil, Calathis Prime. Commander Kalen Sorrel, Acting Authority. Elderwood specimen has succumbed to necrosis. Total biomass collapse. All extraction operations are to be suspended immediately. Repeat, the forest is dead. He looked at the tree, at Elara's face in the bark, at the roots that were still spreading, stabilizing the failing crust, sealing the dome's cracks with living tissue. Long live the forest, he said, too quietly for the comm to catch. Aaron clutched the field recorder, the small device that held Elara's voice, her transformation, her truth, and began to broadcast. The artificial dawn stretched into true morning, and the grove did not sleep. Aaron Thorne stood with his back against the old monitoring station's outer wall, field recorder clipped to his belt, datapad in hand. The screen flickered with a cadence he'd never seen recorded, a single pulse, deep as ocean trenches, rolling through the root system telemetry every 93 seconds. The biosignature monitor captured it faithfully. One beat, planetary and slow, where the 11-spike rhythm had once stuttered with necrosis. Above him, the dome's polycarbon panels wept condensation that no longer froze. Atmospheric processors hummed at reduced capacity, chewing air that grew richer by the hour. The gold moss at Aaron's feet pulsed in time with the new rhythm, a luminous tide that had spread from the grove's center to the farthest sealed cracks in Section 7. Then the tree moved, not a tremor. Not the muscular root shift he'd felt 3 days ago when Elara called the roots upward. This was growth at speed, bark plates groaning, willow-like branches unspooling toward the dome's apex, leafy tendrils peeling away from the main trunk and launching across the grove floor like seeking fingers. Aaron stumbled back, boots skidding on moss-slick stone, as a vine as thick as his wrist shot past his knee and plunged into a maintenance grate. The datapad shrieked an alert he'd never heard. He glanced down. Biomonitor archives uplink, planetary scale route, propagation detect. Commander Kalen Sorrel appeared at the grove's entrance, silver hair disheveled, scar from jaw to temple, standing out white against his weathered skin. He wore no sidearm. The 4 security personnel behind him had shed their containment gear. The young woman who'd hesitated with the stasis projector now carried a thermos of coffee. "It's not stopping," Sorrel said, voice rough. "Thermal veins are spiking. Every crack in the crust, the roots are following them." Aaron opened his mouth to respond, but the datapad flashed a new dataset. Atmospheric nitrogen had dropped 4% in 10 minutes, replaced by oxygen and a cocktail of trace volatiles. The sensors flagged as analogous to Terran deciduous exhalation. The forest was breathing out. "The corporate harvesting team," Aaron managed. "They'll see this. The core. Let them see." Sorrel stepped into the grove, boots careful on the moss, as vines curled around his ankles like pets. "I falsified the report to stop extraction." This he gestured at the branches now brushing the dome's apex. "This is a declaration." Above them, the polycarbon groaned. A crack spidered across a panel, but before Aaron could shout, a tendril of living wood sealed the fissure with golden sap, knitting glass and bark in a seam stronger than the original weld. The first vine breached the dome 2 hours later, and Calathis Prime gasped. Aaron watched from the observation deck as the frozen wasteland beyond the outpost writhed the vine. A sinuous, segmented cable of woody tissue and phosphorescent moss emerged from an exhaust vent on the dome's exterior and struck the permafrost like a lightning bolt. More followed, dozens of them, then hundreds, unspooling across the icy plain in a radial bloom that the orbital satellites must have captured within minutes. His datapad lit with incoming hails from Core Command. He ignored them. The field recorder, still broadcasting on all frequencies, played Elara's logs in a loop, her voice, calm and harmonic, describing the Heartwood's song, the neural conduction protocol, the choice to merge. He let it run. Sorrel stood beside him, arms crossed. I've received a summons, court-martial. They're calling my report fraudulent. They'll see the truth, Aaron said. They'll see what they want. A miracle or a weapon. But the ecological miracle declared itself before any court could convene. Within a week, the vines had crossed 1,000 kilometers, thawing permafrost with metabolic heat, seeding the frozen crust with mycelial networks that bound soil and stone. The atmosphere thickened, oxygen-rich, tinged with the scent of blooming things. Orbital scans showed green sprawling across the dead continents. The Core's executive board, in closed session, voted to delay harvesting pending full assessment. A bureaucratic stall that bought the forest time, Aaron stayed. He converted Outpost Vigil's hydroponics bay into a cataloging station, the monitoring room into a library, the hidden greenhouse off the Eastern Service corridor into a shrine of pressed leaves and audio logs. He documented the hybrid ecosystem with a taxonomist's precision, lichen that fed on thermal radiation, insectoids born from soil that remembered animal blueprints, water cycles that sang with mycelial resonance. The field recorder became a permanent fixture, its speaker playing Elara's words to every corner of the outpost. Sorrel returned 2 months later, exonerated. The court-martial had convened, heard testimony from orbital biologists, reviewed the biomonitor archives, and declared the forest a planetary asset. Sorrel's falsified report was condemned in private and quietly expunged from the record. He resigned his commission the same day and arrived at the outpost with a single duffel bag. "You're still here," he said, finding Aaron in the monitoring room. "The forest needs a gardener, not anymore." Sorrel set his bag on a console. "It needs a guardian." They worked in silence after that, Aaron cataloguing, Sorrel patrolling the perimeter, both listening for the deep pulse that now served as the outpost's clock. The voice came 3 months into the first spring. Aaron was kneeling at the base of the Elderwood tree, taking a core sample from a new branch. When the moss beneath his knees flared white gold, he froze. The datapad registered a spike in mycelial neuroactivity, a pattern he recognized, 94.7% match to sentient neural signaling. Erin. The sound came from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the roots, the bark, the leaves, the air thick with pollen. "Elara," he pressed his palm to the trunk, bark met skin, warm and alive. "Not just Elara, I am the forest now. The Heartwood gave me their memory, and I wove it into mine. All the trees are one, and I am one with them. My memories are intact. My love is intact." Tears tracked through the dust on Aaron's face. "You're still you. I am a Gestalt being. But that part of me that was Dr. Elara Vance, 34 years old, formerly of the Terra Restoration Corps, formerly in love with a man named Aaron Thorne. That part remembers, that part speaks." He rested his forehead against the trunk. Her face was still there, carved in the wood, eyes closed in serene permanence. But the bark around her mouth had softened, and when the voice spoke again, he felt the vibration shape itself into words he could trace with his fingers. "The forest doesn't need a gardener anymore. It needs a heart. I chose to become that heart. You chose to stay. Now I need you to choose again. What do you want me to do? Continue your work. Catalog everything. Teach the core what sentience truly means. Show them that worlds can bloom without being burned for profit. And you, I am at peace, Aaron. The thermal veins sing, and I sing with them. The crust heals, the air warms. I will live as long as this world lives." He closed his eyes. "I thought I lost you." "You did," the voice said, gentle as falling leaves. "And you found me again. That is the nature of forests. They die and return." Behind him, footsteps. Sorrel stood in the grove entrance, dark eyes missing nothing he'd heard. "She's in the network," Aaron said without turning. "The mycelium carries her consciousness." "I know." Sorrel's voice was steady. "I've heard her at night, beneath the pulse. She sings." Aaron pulled back from the trunk, wiping his face. "Then you hear her too. Every guard who stays does." Sorrel approached, placing a scarred hand on the bark beside Aaron's. "I've seen worlds burn. This one will freeze if we don't act. But not like this, not with fire and suppression, with listening." A new pulse rolled through the grove, deeper than any before. The gold moss surged, the leaves above rustled, though no wind moved. Elara's voice came one last time, harmonic and warm, with the ancient undertone of the Heartwood woven through it. "I will speak to you when needed. Until then, be the custodian. First of many." Aaron looked at Sorrel. The former commander nodded. "I promise," Aaron said to the tree, to the forest, to the planet. "I'll be your custodian." The pulse steadied. The moss dimmed to ember gold, and the silent bloom continued, patient and unstoppable, beneath the dome that no longer held a garden but a genesis. The years had been kind to Calathis Prime, if not to the man who walked beneath its canopy. Aaron Thorne moved through the understory, with the careful gait of someone who had long ago traded urgency for reverence. His hair, once light brown and sun-streaked only at the temples, had gone entirely to silver, thin as thread in places, and the pale blue eyes that had once tracked necrosis percentages across a monitor now squinted against the dappled light falling through a ceiling of leaves. His frame had kept its sharp angles, but age had whittled him further, leaving him lean in the way of old roots that held fast against the wind. He wore no uniform, carried no title that the Corps would recognize anymore. His datapad, the same standard-issue device he had used for decades, hung from a worn strap across his shoulder, its screen dimmed but still pulsing with telemetry. He no longer needed instruments to feel. Around him, the forest breathed. It had no other name now, not officially. The Corps called it the Calathis Biosphere Restoration Zone in their reports, but the people who came, the researchers, the pilgrims, the occasional journalist granted a landing permit, called it Elara's Thicket. The name had spread the way the vines once had, unstoppable and organic, until even the Corps archivist began using it in footnotes. Aaron had never corrected them. He had simply walked the paths as they formed, cataloguing every new species, every emergent behavior, and he had let the name take root as surely as the forest itself. The dome at Outpost Vigil still stood, though its polycarbon panels were now more suggestion than structure. The tree that had once been Elara had grown through the apex decades ago, shattering the reinforced plates with the patient insistence of living wood, and the forest had followed. Vines spiraled up the interior walls, moss covered the old monitoring stations. The atmospheric processors had fallen silent. 40 years ago, their function rendered obsolete by a planet that had learned to breathe on its own. The dome was no longer a sealed environment. It was a clearing, a cathedral, the original grove that had become the heart of a planetary organism. Aaron stepped over a root thicker than his waist, its bark worn smooth by years of his passage, and emerged into the central grove. The tree waited for him as it always did. It had grown beyond any measurement that mattered. The trunk was a wall of bark plates, each one the color of aged mahogany shot through with veins of gold that pulsed faintly in 93-second intervals, a rhythm Aaron had timed so many thousands of times that his own heartbeat seemed to sync to it when he stood close. The willow-like branches cascaded from a crown, lost in the upper canopy, slender and green, and perpetually trembling with emotion that had no wind to account for. And at the center of the trunk, at the height of a human heart, the bark had shaped itself into a face. Her face, Elara's face, carved in relief by the forest's own slow artistry. The closed eyes that had once blazed green light now serene and permanent. The suggestion of her jaw, her brow, the ghost of her hair transformed into a halo of smaller branches and leaves. The carving had not faded with time. If anything, it had deepened, as if the tree had spent decades remembering her more precisely. Aaron approached and pressed his palm to the trunk just below her face. The bark was warm. It had always been warm, even in the decades before the permafrost had fully thawed across the planet. Even when winter winds had howled against the dome, the forest's metabolic heat radiated from every surface now, a living blanket that had rewritten the climate of an entire world. The pulse answered him, faint, distant, as if traveling from the other side of a continent to reach him, but unmistakable. The deep, oceanic thrum of the mycelial network, the single beat that had replaced the old 11-spike rhythm so long ago. It was slower than it had been in those first months, calmer, the heartbeat of a planet that was no longer fighting to survive. "There you are," Aaron whispered. His voice had grown thin with age, but the words carried the same tenderness they had held for 60 years. The moss at his feet flared white gold in response, then subsided. He stood there for a long moment, letting the warmth seep into his palm, into the arthritic knuckles and the papery skin. Then he stepped back and turned to the smaller marker that stood in the shadow of the great tree. It was a simple thing, a slab of native stone that Aaron had hauled from the eastern ridge when his back was still strong enough for such work. The words carved into it had been done by hand, not by any tool, and the letters had weathered with the dignity of something meant to endure. Commander Callan Sorrel, protector of the first Seedhe, heard her Singarin had buried him 53 years ago, in the soil where the first vine had breached the dome. Sorrel had been 81, his cropped silver hair gone entirely white, the scar from jaw to temple faded to a pale line against weathered skin. but his dark eyes had missed nothing until the very end. He had died in the grove, sitting with his back against Elara's trunk, his sidearm still stored in his quarters where he had left it, the day he returned, exonerated and unburdened. Aaron had found him at dawn, his posture still rigid with old military discipline even in death, and the moss had grown over his hands as if the forest itself had been holding him. He would have hated the poetry, Aaron said to the stone as he always did when he visited, but he earned it. The forest did not answer in words. It rarely did anymore. The Gestalt consciousness that carried Elara's voice had grown vast and slow over the decades. Its attention spread across continental mycelial webs and deep-root taproots that reached into the planet's mantle. She spoke less often now, not because she was fading, but because she was so large that human language required an effort of focus she seldom needed to make. When she did speak, it was in dreams, in the rustle of leaves, in the sudden harmonic resonance of a breeze through branches. Aaron had grown fluent in those languages. He touched Sorrel's marker once, a brief brush of fingertips against the worn stone, and then moved on, following a path that led deeper into the grove. The path was new. He had not walked it before. That, in itself, was not unusual. The forest rearranged itself constantly, roots shifting, new growth emerging overnight, trails opening and closing with the slow deliberation of a mind thinking in centuries. But the fact that this path had opened today on this morning, when Aaron had woken with the certainty that his own body was nearing its final season, that was not coincidence. The forest knew, it had always known. He pushed through a curtain of hanging moss and stopped. The sapling stood in a shaft of sunlight, no more than 3 feet tall, its trunk slender and smooth, with the pale green of new growth. It had emerged from a crack in the stone, where a thermal vent pulsed warm air, and its roots had already spread across the surrounding soil in a delicate web. The leaves were the shape of Elara's hands, or what Aaron remembered of her hands, long-fingered, elegant, the kind of hands that had been made for holding delicate instruments and pressing into soil. And on the sapling's trunk, still forming but unmistakable, was a face, not a carving, not a relief in bark. It was as if the wood itself had grown around the suggestion of features, the curve of a cheekbone, the closed arch of an eye, the faintest hint of lips parted in sleep. The likeness was not Elara's. It was younger, softer, a variation on the theme, but the pattern was the same hybrid morphology, the same merger of human and tree. Aaron sank to his knees in the moss. His joints protested, but he barely noticed. She had never told him. In all the decades of cataloguing, of documenting every species of lichen and insectoid and flowering vine, of transmitting his findings to the Corps and the universities, and anyone who would listen, Elara had never once mentioned that the forest had learned to remember her shape, that the seeds it sent, drifting across the continents on currents of thermal wind, carried not just the genetic blueprint of the Elderwood, but the template of the woman who had merged with its consciousness. The sapling's face was not alone. As Aaron's eyes adjusted to the light, he saw others beyond it, dozens of young trees pushing up through the undergrowth, each one bearing the same nascent features. Some were barely more than shoots, their faces only a suggestion. Others were nearly as tall as he was, their expressions distinct, individual, as if each sapling carried a different facet of the original. They were not clones, they were children. The forest was not just propagating itself, it was propagating her. The realization settled over him like a blanket of leaves. Elara's sacrifice had not ended with the restoration of a planet. It had birthed a new form of consciousness, one that would spread across Calathis Prime in the centuries to come, a civilization of beings who would carry her legacy in their very bark. She had become a mother not of one forest, but of a people. "You never did anything halfway," Aaron said. His voice cracked on the last word, not from grief, but from a joy so vast it felt like grief's echo. The moss beneath his knees pulsed gold, once, twice, in rhythm with the planetary heartbeat. He stayed there for a long time, studying the sapling's face, memorizing the particular angle of its closed eyes, and the way the light caught the fine hairs of new moss growing along its branches. His datapad recorded everything automatically. It had been doing so for 60 years, building the archive that would outlast him. But he wanted the memory for himself. This moment, this discovery, belonged to the man who had once stood in a hidden greenhouse and begged a woman not to merge with a tree. Just because you can merge with a tree doesn't mean you should. The words felt like they belonged to a stranger now. That younger Aaron, sharp-angled and terrified, had not yet understood what he was asking her to refuse. Not just survival, but this a future, a legacy written in chlorophyll and mycelium. and the slow unfurling of leaves across a world that had been dead before she gave herself to it. He rose eventually and made his way back to the great tree. His body moved more slowly now, each step a negotiation with gravity and time. He had lived 78 years, 60 of them in service to a forest that had given him everything: purpose, redemption, the voice of the woman he loved whispering through the roots. The Corps had long since accepted his presence as permanent. His falsified logs and Sorrel's false report had either been forgotten or deliberately buried by bureaucrats who recognized a miracle when they saw one and preferred not to examine its origins too closely. Researchers came and went, pilgrims arrived with offerings of water and soil from other worlds, and Aaron had taught them all about sentience, about symbiosis, about the difference between cultivating a forest and loving one. The forest doesn't need a gardener anymore. It needs a heart. She had been right, and he had tried, in his own stumbling human way, to be that heart alongside her. Now he settled himself against the trunk of the Elderwood tree, his back to the warm bark, his legs stretched out across the moss. The face carved above him was his canopy. The pulse beneath him was his lullaby. In the distance he could see the sun lowering through the gaps in the dome's broken apex, painting the grove in shades of amber and rose. He was tired, the good tired, the earned tired, the kind that came from decades of work well done. His catalogue was complete, or as complete as any catalogue of a living, evolving world could be. The Corps had trained a new generation of custodians, young biologists and ecologists who had grown up hearing Elara's logs on the broadcast frequency, and who treated the forest with the reverence it deserved. Aaron had taught them how to listen, how to interpret the pulse, how to understand that they were not studying a specimen but engaging with a mind. They would carry the work forward. He had one thing left to do. Elara, he said, and the name was both a prayer and a calling. The moss flared, the bark warmed, and after a long moment the air itself seemed to thicken, to gather, to shape itself around a voice that was still. After all these years, the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. Aaron, not words, not exactly. A resonance, a harmonic, a vibration that traveled through the roots and the soil and the bones of his spine. But he had spent 60 years learning to hear her, and he understood. I found them, he said. The saplings, the ones with faces. A pulse of warmth, like sunlight moving across his chest. They are us, what we made, what we will always be. He closed his eyes. The datapad on his strap beeped softly, recording his vitals, recording the pulse, recording everything. It would continue to do so after he was gone, transmitting to the monitoring station, feeding the archive. The field recorder in the old monitoring room still played Elara's logs on loop, her voice cycling through the stations of the core frequencies, and it would keep playing until the equipment failed or the planet died. Aaron had made sure of that. I'm ready, he said. He did not know if she could take him the way the Heartwood had taken her. He did not know if the merger required the specific protocols of neural conduction, or if the forest could accept a human consciousness that had spent 6 decades living in symbiosis with its rhythms. But he knew, with the certainty of someone who had listened to a planet breathe for most of his adult life, that it was possible. The network was vast enough. The mycelium remembered everything, every root, every pulse, every word spoken in love. He had poured his life into this soil. The soil would know him. A root stirred beneath the moss, curling gently around his ankle. Not binding, asking. Stay, he whispered his answer. Always. The bark at his back softened, just slightly, just enough to cradle his shoulders. The moss crept up over his legs, warm and alive. Above him the face in the trunk seemed almost to smile, though the carved lips did not move, an illusion of light perhaps, or of love. The planetary pulse beat at 93-second intervals, deep as ocean trenches, steady as a promise. Aaron Thorne, once a senior research consultant with pale blue eyes and a sharp analytical mind, now an old man with sun-streaked hair gone silver, let his breathing slow. He thought of Sorrel, standing with no sidearm in the dome, on the day the first vine breached. He thought of the hidden greenhouse, and the field jacket still hanging on its shelf, and the bioscanner buried somewhere in the soil with its battery long dead. He thought of the day he had pressed his forehead to this very trunk, and heard Elara's voice for the first time in 3 months, and the way the words, "I have always been with you," had broken him open and put him back together. He thought of the saplings, stretching their new faces toward the light, and of the centuries they would have to grow, to think, to become whatever the forest intended them to become. Guardians of their own world, ambassadors to others, a bridge between human consciousness and the ancient, patient mind of the Elderwood. He was not afraid. He had not been afraid for a long time. The root around his ankle tightened, not with urgency but with welcome. The mycelium at the edge of his awareness brightened, a network of light spreading beneath the soil. And at its center was a presence that was both Elara and something larger. The gestalt, the memory, the chorus of all the lives the forest had touched, and at its heart, still, after everything, was love. Arin pressed his palm to the bark one last time. The pulse answered, the moss glowed, and as the sun set over Calathis Prime, painting the global canopy of Elara's thicket in shades of gold and green, the old man who had been the forest's first custodian let go of his body and stepped into the network, where she was waiting.